Hello, my name is Wouter van Eck. I'm a food forest farmer in the Netherlands, and my presentation is about the role of exotics. In food forestry, they have to play a role, is one of my statements. But what are the consequences for biodiversity? Is it a threat or is it stimulating for biodiversity? So food forestry is having a polyculture of plants, and some of them will be exotic. What are the consequences of introducing these exotic species into the agricultural system? Well, if you look at this slide, it's my first slide, but it looks like it's two parts, but it's one landscape. The bottom part is a conventional agricultural field meant to grow corn, a monoculture crop, and also an exotic crop. We are in the Netherlands. The corn is coming from Mexico and Guatemala. But this is just one species in 1,000 plants on the monoculture cropping system. The above part is part of our food forest. So these are two neighboring agricultural systems in the very same landscape. Another slide from the Netherlands. This is advice from our authorities how to eat healthy for Dutch citizens. And you might recognize some of the crops and foods involved. And I will briefly mention them. I start with the cup of tea close to the bottom. And as you might know, tea is Camellia sinensis and originating from China. Then we have potatoes at the right of the circle. They are from Peru, the Andes country in Latin America. There is bread, whole grain bread, which is supposed to be more healthy, of course, but all grains grown in Europe are originating from Asia. They arrived maybe 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, but they are originating from Asia, so there are exotic species. The beans are from South America. The pasta is like the grains from South America. The apple is from Kazakhstan. The banana from Papua, so Southeast Asia. The sweet pepper, the paprika, is from Mexico. The orange from China. The carrots from Iran. The green beans from South America. The tomato from Mexico. The broccoli, well, this is a European one. The tofu is containing soy from China, and the sunflower in the bottom is from Northern America. So the Dutch menu, what I advise us to eat, and the many plants involved, since eating plants is very healthy, is based upon many exotic species, most of them in use in Dutch agriculture. This is a slide from harvest from our food forest. In September, a season of abundance, we have many species where we harvest from. And I believe this slide is containing 32 different botanical species. And I always said only 2 of them are indigenous, so native to our landscape and our ecosystems. One of them is the stinging nettle, a nutritious vegetable in the mid, and the other is the hazel. But I have been corrected. The hazel, which has been growing in our areas for thousands of years, is introduced by humans because at old camping sites or place where the people lived in the Neolithicum, they first found the leftovers of the cracked nuts, the nut shells, and later on the pollen. So hazel was down south and taken north by humans. And exactly this is the definition of exotic species. They are brought into a new landscape by humans. So even the hazelnut, which is common for centuries, for millennia, is introduced by humans in Northern Europe. The brilliant Russian scientist Vavilov, almost a century, came up with his theory on certain places of origin where our crops, which we depend upon in our agricultural systems, they tend to originate from a few hotspots of biodiversity. So they are on this map. He did draw this map almost a century ago, and you can recognize certain areas where really the rice, the grains, the potato, the pumpkin are coming from, and now they are used in other areas as well. How come? What makes this possible that small pockets on our Earth have much higher biodiversity and other areas are depending to feed themselves on the other hotspots of biodiversity? Well, on this map of a part of Northern Europe, you see the frontier of the glaciers. During ice ages, the glacier was coming south, passing Scandinavia, and here you see in the mid-Germany, Berlin is at the right of this map, our small country, the Netherlands, is at the left of this map, and you see we were for a big part covered with ice. And under a glacier, no plant can grow. So many plants tried to move south, but well, in the south, there was mountains with ice. In Southern Europe, the Alps, the Pyrenees, the Central Massif in France, but also a Mediterranean Sea, meaning they could not escape further to the south. You might compare this with the geography of the Northern America, the United States and Canada. The Rocky Mountains are quite precise from north to south into the Sierra Nevada of Mexico. And you could walk in those slowly processes of climate change during arriving ice age as a tree or shrub from Canada to Mexico. And afterwards, you could walk back. But in Europe, the vegetation was trapped. So many trees and shrubs got extinct. In the past, we did have magnolia, we did have caria, pecan, ginkgo. Many species were growing in Europe, but disappeared during these events of ice ages. And therefore, we depend upon other parts of the globe where the very same species survived the ice ages. Well, back again, another aerial picture of our food forest in the Netherlands. It's a coincidence that the hills, we call them mountains, by the way, but the hills you see in the south, the side the sun is shining from, was the frontier of that glacier. So our food forest, not being there, was covered with the ice mass 150,000 years ago. At the left, you see the picture of our very same area back in 2009. But also interesting is this aerial picture shows a nearby nature reserve. It's just 400 meters south of our food forest. And the nature reserve has been maintained and taken care for by the State Nature Agency since the 1930s, almost a century also. It's Natura 2000. It's woodlands and meadows, partly swamps, very nice area. It's good to have such an area nearby your food forest because we need biodiversity in the food forest for pollination, for plague and pest control, the predators. When they live nearby, they can adopt and come to our food forest as well. And we are very glad with a brilliant done research in April, May, and June 2016 about species in our food forest and in that nature reserve nearby in the very same landscape. And it was a standardized research. So it was the same methods, the same amount of time, the same surface. So they took 2.42 hectare, close to 6 acres, of that nature reserve to do the same research as in our food forest, having the same size. And they were looking at 3 groups of animals which they called indicator species. Like the nesting birds, well, they need feed and place to nest. They say something about the quality of an ecosystem, of the nature around, to have the birds being able to nest. The nocturnal butterflies, which is a species, partly they come first year, a nocturnal butterfly has been a caterpillar, so it needs plants to feed upon. But partly the nocturnal butterflies need pollen and nectar to feed the butterflies when they're at that stage of their life. This cannot happen in a monoculture, not happen in an empty space. They are saying something, the amount in which they appear, about the quality of the landscape and the variety of the vegetation. Same with ground beetles or creeping beetles. They live in the on the soil surface. They need place to hide. They need feed. Some eat other beetles. Some are vegetarian or even vegan. So it's all kinds of different species, but they need surrounding and habitats, so to say, with ecologists. And then the outcome was quite amazing, since, well, it was roughly the same for the amount of nesting birds, the species and the nests themselves. It was roughly the same about the amount of species in the food forest system, voedselbos in Dutch. But the individuals were almost 1,000 more. So this is a difference in advantage of the food forest system. This I did not expect on forehand, this outcome, but it is saying something about the quality of a food forest system being a polyculture and mimicking a natural forest as an ecosystem, and therefore giving food and place to hide and accumulating biomass above soil and in the soil, so many other creatures can live and play a role in the growing system. And this is happening amazingly fast. We see a lot of other rare species, like some snakes, like the beaver, like weasel, amphibians. They all live in our food forest, and they return fast, and partly they eat insects, partly they eat leaves from the vegetation. And of course, you don't want your food forest to be eaten for the total, but that's why predators have an important role. Some fowlens arrive, mouses, and then the weasel arrives to balance. Those things happen in the food forest system. And this all is happening in this polyculture of native and non-native species together. And this is the big issue when you find yourself in a debate with many ecologists. They have learned at school, at university, that exotic species are not as good for biodiversity as native species. And they say you have to plant indigenous species to make nature returning to our landscape, because we live in a country where 70 to 80% of the volume of insects has disappeared, where millions of birds have disappeared. We have an empty landscape. But if you want to restore, the ecologists say, use native plants, use indigenous plants, even with the genes of the local vegetation. But this is actually not based on research. This is only saying some species love certain plants, and they never researched, or hardly ever researched, the community of plants and the role this can play for our rare and disappearing insects and other species in the landscape. And the food forest is never a monoculture, it's always a polyculture. So this is the big thing in debates with those narrow-minded, I would say, view of saying exotics are always wrong. A glance of findings on earthworms in the soil. At the left, the nature reserve. In mid, conventional agricultural field. At the right, our food forest. Also, standardized research, same methods, same period of year, same landscape. And the food forest is having significant more earthworms in the soil. And as you might know, earthworms are the heroes of the soil food web, building organic matter really into the soil and creating possibilities for all the other heroes of the soil food web. A very important part. It's so to say a key species of the soil food web, the earthworms and their good work, also letting water infiltrate, storing oxygen in soil. It all is based upon having what Charles Darwin called this humble creator, which is humble but very, very important. Looking at exotics, there are some misunderstandings, and therefore I choose for this presentation to look at it. Why are people so nervous sometimes about exotic species? Sometimes it's even sounding like botanical racism. And what are they afraid of? One of the things is exotic species can grow rampant. They look like they take over. It's really what people say. But for instance, bamboo, with the delicious and nutritious edible shoots, this plant, Philostachys species, is growing rampant, luckily, but it's not spreading to other parts of the landscape because it's not self-seeding. Bamboos are running, but that's on the spot where they are planted by humans for beauty. Some people like the view, or as a crop in our food forest. And in this case, is even harvesting is partly the maintenance. And if some people have a fight with their neighbors about the bamboo conquering the next garden, well, they should have eaten more. If you can beat it, eat it. It's delicious. It's important in Asian cuisine, but we can enjoy it as well. But still, it's not invasive if a plant is at a spot growing very well, because it's not taking over other spots. So please be precise in how to look at plants and their role in the landscape. Then you might be familiar with the issue of the ecological succession, or even how a bare planet Earth, became lush with forest, covering about 80% of the terrestrial area. It starts with little and it grows into a mixed forest. And the mixed forest is best productive and doing very well. But the pioneer plants will kickstart this system, are the ones spreading very well and taking over landscape, looks like, for some time. But pioneer plants, you also can say, are opportunistic plants. When there is a possibility for them to arrive in the landscape, they have small seeds, they spread easily, and they take over. And then ecological succession continues, and they disappear. Pioneer species, most of them are short living species. Some of them only one season, some of them only 50 years, which is very little time in ecological standards. They disappear and are taken over by mid-succession and climate vegetation. Humans are partly impatient, and they think when they see a species taking over that they have to do something. And if they did do nothing, the plants would disappear by themselves. And partly our efforts in the landscape, we call this maintenance, are disrupting and bringing back certain opportunities for the pioneer species. So again, if you have a bare field, like the very first slide I showed, when you grow a monoculture crop, you don't like the weeds. In your vegetable garden with annual crops, you don't like the weeds. But the weeds are there because you did create bare soil. And after a few years of letting those pioneer plants called weeds grow, they disappear, and the succession of the system continues. This slide shows a part of Côte d'Azur in the south of France. And when I was walking over there, I did notice some nice plants. Well, there's an orange tree up there, and the orange is citrus species is originating from China and Laos, so from Asia. In the back, you see Agave americana from America. And the yellow plant flowering next to the road, the steep path, is an oxalis species. And this one is coming from the south of Africa. So this is a multicultural society of plants. 3 continents available in this part of Europe. And by the way, you also see tarmac, houses, humans, electricity. But people sometimes are very unhappy when they see this nice yellowing flowering plant. By the way, it's like wood sorrel. You can eat it. It's a little pleasant acid, fresh taste. So again, if you can beat it, eat it. But let's take a closer look to that plant. Well, in this picture, you see the shade of the photographer, one of the oranges falling down there at the left, this one here. But you also see a certain hoverfly, almost like a UFO, a bit to the right in the midst. The hoverfly is liking this plant. So this is biodiversity in action. This hoverfly is coming here for pollen and nectar and made available by a plant originating from South Africa, but growing in France and considered to be an invasive exotic. Back to the previous slide. Well, how much of this landscape is original? Well, it's nothing. If we let grow everything here again, a forest would return after some decades or centuries, dominated by oaks. Quercus ilex, Quercus robur, both can grow here. Even the linden tree, Tilia cordata, can grow here, but they were taken away by the humans and way too much cattle, destroying the landscape. And then came the roads and the villas and the cars, and there's little space left. And in this little space, this insect still finds something to eat, and it's coming from another country. We should not fight this plant. If we really want this plant being less dominant in the future, we can let grow things outshaded. But the maintenance is disturbance. So next to the road, they don't allow the oaks to grow, and therefore you get some pioneer species. We're coming close to the end of this session. This was a nice research done in the Canada, British Columbia, in the west of Canada, where they found a landscape. It was a forested landscape where in the past, in the 18th century, people had added trees, nuts and fruits and berries for their food production. And when in the 19th century, the population decreased because the European diseases, actually cattle diseases, came to that area, it was left. So it was a forest garden or food forest avant la lettre, and people did not harvest anymore or did use it anymore, but they were, they left it to biodiversity. And in this research, it's shown that insects, mammals, birds still are in much higher amount in that area with those introduced species from elsewhere, so actually exotics, than the indigenous forest around with the non-introduced species. So this is really helpful in the way we can clarify, well, we have to grow food, therefore we need to introduce species. But a food forest system is doing this in a way which is growing abundance for humans and biodiversity at the same moment. Back to Vavilov, the map I've shown before. And this is actually a century ago. Maybe this is a bit Eurocentric. These are the crops known at that time in St. Petersburg and Paris and Berlin, because people did eat kartoffelsalad, and the potato is coming from Peru, and they did eat gurken, which is cucumbers in different sizes, from India. So this is, you can see on this map. And the Europeans, with their continent with little biodiversity of plants left since the Ice Age, they were depending heavily upon annual crops. They were introduced with the Neolithic Revolution from so-called Levant, from Asia, and that's the way the Europeans did agriculture, and were partly causing erosion and going down of the fertility of the soil. But in this picture, in this map, it's very strange that the Amazon and the Congo, with their huge biodiversity and a lot of edible species, are not mentioned. Even, and this is saying something about annual species being dominant in agricultural way of thinking and in our daily menu, and the perennial species being out of the system in the way of thinking to landscapes. And this is even Eurocentric. When the Europeans came to the other countries, they did think those forests, the Amazon and Congo area, were an original forest. By now we know it was not. People were living there, people were feeding themselves, and we are feeding themselves healthy without destroying the forest system, but with adapting the forest system. So Vavilov is not aware of the food forest things, but Europeans did have little trees where they could eat from. So they were seeing trees as timber instead of being a source of food. Well, this presentation is about combining everything. I have to finish here, but one goodbye by this other inhabitant of our food forest, Bufo in the scientific name, the common toad. This lady is quite fat. She's not yet singing, but she likes to eat snails and slugs and other insects in our food forest system, being a part of biodiversity as well and taking care for each other in the rich system. this was my presentation. We can stop the session here, but I'm looking forward to any comments.